just undid my school trousers and started to abuse me. And that was the only time he's ever spoken during the abuse. And that was to ask me if it hurt, to which I said yes. And then he stopped and made me sit up and pray with him. And he prayed to Jehovah to forgive both of us because we'd both done something wrong. And it was from that point that I knew I'd never be able to say anything. I was born and raised a Jehovah's Witness, and that was my normal. So from the time I was probably in the womb, I was read my book of Bible stories, which had a lot of pictures that involved quite a lot of blood and gore. So Cain killing Abel and things like that. It was quite horrific. And that was how I was brought up. I was brought up with the Bible. I was brought up to believe and trust in Jehovah God and love him more than I love my own family and my own parents, things like that. As a Jehovah's Witness, we couldn't celebrate Christmas or Easter or birthdays, and that was fine because I'd never done it. I didn't feel I was missing out on much until children at school get to colour in their Christmas trees or write birthday cards. And twice a week, my life revolved around going to a Kingdom Hall, which is a bit like going to church. And Tuesday evenings from 7:15 till about 9 o'clock, we would be at the Kingdom Hall, and Sundays for a couple of hours. And when I was younger, probably up until about 13, there used to be a Thursday book group at our house as well, and that involved more Bible study, so it was quite intense growing up as a Jehovah's Witness. There's a lot of pressure on you in your life. You're very controlled as a witness because you're told what you can do, what you can't do, how you behave in the Kingdom Hall as a child will reflect on your parents, and they can be looked at negatively if you're sort of sat there drawing or colouring or not listening. So it was a very intense upbringing, but because I didn't know any different, that was my normal.
And so, as a part of the Jehovah's Witness, when and how did the abuse start?
So my mum and dad got divorced when I was about 3 or 4 years old, and my mum remarried an elder called Clifford Whiteley when I was about 6 or 7. And the first couple of years of that marriage were fine. Nothing was abnormal. Cliff was seen as a very pious man. It was as though he was filled with Holy Spirit that just flowed out of him, and every congregation in the West Midlands knew him and really loved him and looked to him as a very authoritative figure within the congregation that they could respect and love. And his story of how he came into the religion, people admired. So he was a well-respected man. So for Mum to marry him, it was seemed like the perfect situation because he was a very spiritual man. He would look after us, and our spirituality was the most important thing that had to be looked after, even more so than food and somewhere to sleep, as long as you had a good spiritual relationship. It wasn't until I started getting older, I guess, and to an age where you almost start to develop. So from about the ages of 11 or 12 was when the abuse started. So he hadn't done anything before. There was no inclination that he was going to do anything before. It just happened. I was always close with him and I loved him as a dad. He was a good father figure up until that point. And we went to his daughter from a previous marriage had a party, and we were invited and we got to stay over at a hotel, and it was very exciting. And the room we stayed in had a masonette, so there was a bedroom on the top and then a sofa bed downstairs for me and my sister. And before we went to go to the actual party, I was too excited to sleep. I'd already put on my new dress and I slept with him and Mum in their bed, which wasn't an unusual thing to do. We were a very sort of cuddly family. And it was Mum in the bed, him, and then me on the end. And I couldn't sleep, I was too excited. My mum was asleep, he was not. And that's when he just started to put his hand up my dress. And that was the first time that he did anything. And I didn't even know what to think. It was because he's never done anything like that before. That was just how it started. So I was scared. I wanted to wake my mum up. I didn't know what to do. It was all very confusing. And after that, that was how the abuse continued for a while. And I went on not saying anything because at that age, it was just too... You didn't really understand, but you knew that it wasn't right, and which meant it was wrong, and therefore you felt equally culpable in whatever this wrongness was because it was happening to you. So that's how it felt for me. And it carried on for a while, and I never said anything. He never said anything. After the first time he abused me, when we eventually went to the party, he sort of grabbed my arm and said sorry, and that was it. He never spoke again until the last time the more graphic abuse happened, when I'd come home from school and I lay on the sofa with my feet on his lap just talking about my day, and he just undid my school trousers and started to abuse me. And that was the only time he's ever spoken during the abuse, and that was to ask me if it hurt. To which I said yes. And then he stopped and made me sit up and pray with him. And he prayed to Jehovah to forgive both of us because we'd both done something wrong. And it was from that point that I knew I'd never be able to say anything because I've made God really angry and I've done something horrible, even though I didn't really understand what it was at the time. And after that, the more graphic abuse stopped, but he still continued to grope me up until 2019. And 2019 was a pivotal year because that was when I finally spoke up about the abuse. And that was to my oldest sister and my brother-in-law. So I'd returned from a 2-month vacation abroad with a friend, and I had the best time, and it was the first time in my life at 21 that I saw what life could be like outside of the Jehovah's Witness community. And that was mind-blowing, that there was something more than knocking on doors and talking about Jehovah and telling people that, you know, that you need to change, otherwise you will die at Armageddon, and thinking I was going to die at Armageddon because I never felt good enough for Jehovah. I never felt good enough within the organisation. I was baptised from the age of 16, and that's a really serious commitment. And when I got baptised, you have to do it in front of thousands of people, and they make you stand up and they ask you 2 questions. And one of them involves, do you understand that you are a part of the organisation? And it's very heavily based upon the organisation and the governing body, who are the leaders in America, more so than it is God. So this dedication to the Jehovah's Witness religion is more so to the men running it than it is to Jehovah himself. And this comes with very serious consequences. So if you sin, which can be if you're smoking, if you get drunk too often, if you're having sex before you're married, it can lead to your expulsion from the religion. And that's known as disfellowshipping. And you can only be disfellowshipped if you're baptised into it because you've dedicated your life. So to do that at 16 is very serious. And at 16, you don't really understand. You think you understand because you feel very mature and grown up and you want to make your parents proud. So that was my reason for getting baptised. There's a lot of pressure that comes into it from the congregation. My mum never really pushed me for it. She doesn't really agree that you should get baptised young, but my stepdad certainly did, and a lot of other members of the congregation were pushing me towards baptism. And I didn't really understand the severity of it at that age until I got older and had the natural inclinations to want to go out with friends, and you want to have a drink, and you just want to be a normal teenager enjoying your life. None of which you can do, because if you get caught, or if the guilt eats away at you so much that you confess to the elders, then that could be it. You'll be cut off from your whole family, from the whole community. And that life, you live in fear. You live in fear, and I think for most young people, you just sort of accept that when what the witnesses teach as Armageddon comes, that you'll just die, and you just accept that. But you carry on going through the motions because you don't want to upset your parents or members of the congregation. So you just carry on. It's a bit of a farce, really. So for this experience of me abroad, it was, okay, wow, maybe I won't die at Armageddon, and because I don't actually really believe in it. But you're almost too scared to think those thoughts, because you're taught that God can read your thoughts and the devil can read your thoughts, and you shouldn't pray out loud because the devil will listen to what you're saying and know your weaknesses and then pull you away from the organisation. So it was a very scary time. So that fear lessened for me. So when I returned and told my sister that I had the best time and all these amazing things happened and I met these wonderful people and I want to go back and life is now really exciting, and they were so supportive, and they said, you know, that's brilliant, go back, do it. What's stopping you from going out there and doing what you want to do? And I think it was almost an escape route for me, because I thought about my mum. I'm the youngest of 5 children. I would be the last one to leave. And then I said, also, there's Cliff. And I just started to cry. And it's the sort of crying that you can't come back from. It's not a few tears and, oh, I don't know why I'm crying. It was heavy sobbing, and I couldn't talk. And her initial thought was, you're pregnant, aren't you? Just tell me you're pregnant. And I sort of shook my head, and is it about Mum? Is it about Cliff? To which I'm like nodding, and has he done something? And again, it's nodding, and is he doing something to you now? And no. And is it in your past? Yeah. And that's how it came out to my family. And that was very traumatic, because that had been 10 years since the very graphic abuse happened. Up until that point, I was still fighting him off of me when I was at home. So if I'd come downstairs in the morning, or if I got ready for work, or if I was going out knocking doors or anything, and I would get dressed and come downstairs, he would always hug me, but it would always be from behind so that he could grope me, and he would not get off. And for a man that was well into his 60s, he was very tall and very strong, and it took a lot of effort, and it wasn't a once a day occurrence. I had to fight him off multiple times a day. And the way that it worked when people were around is he had a habit of poking me and my sister in our sides in front of other people. So we'll be like, oh, get off, Cliff. And that meant that when other people were in the house but not in the same room, he could then still grope me. And when I was yelling to get off, people would just then assume that he was just irritating me by poking my sides, because that's what he did in front of them. So he was very manipulative in that way. That's how it all came out. And then we had to tell my mum, which was very difficult. So she came round after work and I told her, and the first thing she said was that she believed me, which was something you don't really think about, considering that people might not believe you when you finally do speak up about abuse. And then she wanted to go and confront him. But we didn't want her to go by herself to confront him. So it was her decision to take 2 elders from the congregation with her. I don't know whether I can use their names. If you want to crop it out, you can. So she decided to take Clifford and Richardson, so 2 elders from my congregation who I'd known from when I was a child. And yeah, they'd known me my whole life. I loved both of them. I was very attached to both of them. So they went with her, and Cliff denied it initially until the next morning when my mum asked him again whether he abused me, and he said yes, but it was once and he was drunk, and none of which was true, but that's what he said. Or too much to drink. He didn't want to say drunk because that's also seen as a sin, so he said too much to drink. And then he had to tell the elders. By that point, I couldn't be in Birmingham anymore. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want to be in that house anymore. So I stayed with my sister. And my sister said, I think you should report it to the police. And I was very reluctant to do so. So to live with him after everything had happened and to cope with what had happened and not saying anything, my way of coping was to build him up, as almost worship him in a way, and think what an incredible man he was and how amazing he was and how spiritual he was. And that was partly because growing up he isolated me from my mom and my sisters and my brother, and I wasn't allowed any friends outside of the congregation, and even people within the congregation, because he was an elder, he knew a lot of what the younger people were getting up to, and so I'd be told to stay away from them. So he cut me off from everybody in my life so that I just had him. He made it me and him versus my mom and my other sister. So I didn't have a very good relationship with them. I only had a good relationship with him because he made it that way. So I felt at the time that I didn't want to go to the police because it was almost, I felt I still needed to protect him. But my sister said that she could report it on my behalf instead of me, and that felt a bit better that it wasn't coming directly from me. And I'm very, very grateful to her for that. I think I would have massively regretted not reporting him to the police, and it was one of the best things that I ever did, was going ahead with that. So the police got involved, and I had to go and do a video interview going through the graphic details of what happened to me. And the police officer, DC Enzor, who was in charge of my case, had asked if he would have any trouble with the elders cooperating. And my sister hasn't been in the religion for many, many years. And even she was, up until this point, was still very defensive of the organisation. She wouldn't have a bad word said against it at all. So we both said, no, they'll support you, whatever you need, they will cooperate. And he said that I've worked with religious groups before and that isn't the case, but we were adamant that he will have all the support from the organisation, he doesn't need to worry. And it wasn't long after that I then realised the true colours of the Jehovah's Witness organisation. There was a lot I didn't agree with when I was growing up. Some of the teachings didn't sit right with me. I didn't like that women were not allowed any positions within the congregation, and there were a lot of scriptures that were constantly mentioned about women being the weaker vessel, and that Christ is head of the house, and then it's man over woman and things like that. And I never really liked that, and they backtracked a lot of their teachings. So the first man, Charles Taze Russell, that started the organisation, from when he started it until now, their foundation of beliefs have changed so many times, and it's put under the umbrella of new light, that they've had new light into the scriptures, and the teachings that they previously held were no longer true or found to be wrong, and then they would change it. That never sat right with me either. I always thought I would wait until my parents died and then I would leave, because then I don't have to break their hearts by leaving the organisation. So I knew it wasn't for me anyway. But then it got worse. It went beyond their teachings, and then suddenly how they handle things as serious as child abuse was a very big red flag for the whole organisation. And that's sort of what woke me up to knowing that there is absolutely no God behind this organisation. It is just men, and it's these specific men in America representing God as the governing body on earth, and it was horrific. So my story goes that the elders had Cliff's confession, and they had it documented on a written document that 3 witnesses signed. So Cliff had a meeting with 3 elders in March to decide whether he was going to be kicked out of the organisation, because it wasn't an immediate he was going to be kicked out. It had to be a decision made by 3 elders, and this is called a judicial committee. And a judicial committee happens when a serious sin has been committed. Again, that goes back to smoking or if you've had sex. And Cliff, as an elder, will have been part of many judicial committees because he was an elder for well over 20 years. So he knows how they work, and he knows the rules, because all elders have a guidebook, and it's called Shepherd the Flock of God. And that's essentially where they get all their shepherding the congregation information from, and how to deal with things that come up. And there is a section in there about child abuse. And the first thing that they're told to do is to contact headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses in London, so the London Bethel branch, not go to the police, but to contact the headquarters, where there's a team of lawyers that they will need to talk to. And Cliff had his judicial committee, and in his document, that the conversation they had with them went that he was asking to be disfellowshipped. He was almost trying to be a martyr, saying he should be disfellowshipped. And this is where he said that he wasn't drunk, but he'd had too much to drink, which is completely bizarre, because that's an abnormal emotion to have, regardless of if you're drunk or a little bit tipsy. Nobody has the inclination to sexually abuse a child when they've had a drink. It's just disgusting. And this document that they had, we told the police that they will have a document, because that's how it works. They keep on record all these conversations they have with members of the congregation, especially when it comes to something as serious as a judicial committee. And the police got in touch with Dave Clifford and Rudy Dobson, the elders, to ask for the document, and they wouldn't give it over. And they're similar to the Catholic Church, a bit like under a penitent oath. They said that they couldn't hand it over. And this is where everything went downhill, because for a historic case of abuse, it's not very often you can get a conviction. So my case wasn't strong to start with, and Cliff was giving no comment interviews to the police. But we did have a confession that was signed by 3 people that we couldn't get. And it took 7 months of fighting to get that document, and it had to be court ordered that they handed it over. So before we got to that point, I'd asked the elders to come and see me, because I'd known them my whole life. I admired them both, and I didn't understand why they were not going to help me. So they came round, they said a prayer, they shared a scripture about slander, and they said because Clifford told them in confidence about the abuse, that it would be slanderous of him to tell the police. And then they said the only other way they could come forward is if they stepped down from their position as elders in the congregation. And I didn't say anything, because there's 2 of them. I know them both. They both don't need to step down. It can just take one. And they didn't look at me and they didn't say anything. So I just leant forward and said, but he's a paedophile. And they just said, yeah, we know. And they couldn't look at me. I started crying. I started screaming, actually, in fact. And they were sat in front of me on the sofa and I was on the floor. So I leant forward so far, my head almost was touching the floor, and I was screaming and crying, and my sister was trying to comfort me. And I don't really remember much else after that, up until that point. I can't remember what happened after. I just remember that, yeah, we know. And the rest is almost black, because I've already had so much pain and hurt and let down from them. So then to hear that was getting re-traumatized again after everything that I'd gone through, because I just didn't understand how they didn't want to help me or protect me. Instead, they chose to protect a paedophile. And that was heartbreaking, because these are two men that I loved very much, and they let me down big time. And the whole organisation lets down people like me over and over and over again. And my story is one of thousands, and mine isn't even the worst one that's out there. Mine is just a very small part of an epidemic that's happening within the Jehovah's Witness organisation, because they choose to protect paedophiles. And there's even a database that they have with a list of paedophiles going back 10 years. And that is something that is being fought for at the moment, to be handed over to the police, because they refuse to hand it over at the moment. And that's what really made me realise that, yeah, there's no God behind this organisation. This is wrong. You need to protect children. You can't treat people like this. Survivors of abuse don't deserve to be treated like this. Paedophiles do not deserve protecting.